The United States is far from unique in its cynical manipulation of what the innocent voter believes to be democracy. Britain's political decision-makers have always been open to bribes, and many of its celebrated aristocracy owe their status directly to legalised bribery. It wasn't that long ago when it was completely normal and routine practice for commissions in the army to be bought, for example. Army officers were not appointed on merit, their ranks were purchased, and the more money you had, the higher rank you could buy. When fine young officers clutching their purchase licenses to commit crime went on murdering expeditions all around the world on the authority of the British Crown, they were entitled to keep much of the loot they plundered. And when they returned home, they were showered with honours and great country estates and seats in Parliament. The great British hero, the Duke of Wellington, for example, used the system to go from being an almost penniless ruffian to being able to own a country estate which, when he owned it 200 years ago, was worth £400,000, together with a seat in Parliament. So when one sees how very handsomely people like him, and there were of course many, many others, profited out of the practice, it not only becomes pretty obvious why the system was used, but how very widespread and normal bribery was in British government. In the 19th century, the system was so widely recognised and acknowledged, it even had its own name. Old corruption, it was called. The widely held belief amongst most ordinary people that corrupt governments are mostly a third world issue is one of the major triumphs of the first world propaganda machine. For example, a story appeared quite recently in The Times about a Frenchman called Bernard Bertrand, an expert in producing traditional country composts from natural products. Monsieur Bertrand faced a 2-year jail term and a £50,000 fine for the terrible sin of trying to publish his own book on the highly seditious subject of green gardening. Apparently licenses are required in France if you want to sell compost, because of a law which bans the sale or promotion of organic fertilizers. The licenses are hugely expensive and available only after certain tests have been satisfied. Tests designed by and for France's giant agrochemical industry. The article did not say that this French law was drafted by the French agrochemical industry, but it's not unreasonable to think it might have been, because that's certainly how the system works in the United States. Because hugely powerful though the French agricultural lobby undoubtedly is, it pales to insignificance compared with US supergiants such as Monsanto, for example. In his most excellent book, Captive State, George Monbiot has a number of eye-opening revelations for the average innocent, none of which better illustrates the incestuous collusion of corporations and governments than the saga of Monsanto's efforts to force upon a generally unwilling world various genetically modified products during the 80s and 90s. Even foreign companies are welcome to spend serious money lobbying the White House. As we've seen, lobbying is a word for the practice which, when done by third world countries, is called by its far more honest name, bribery. A Swiss news report, for example, revealed that the Swiss drug companies Roche and Novartis had spent $7 million on American politicians in the first half of 2009 to influence policy. Roche's share price leapt from 145 Swiss francs in July of that year to 170 Swiss francs in August, while Novartis' share price grew from 70 Swiss francs to 95 Swiss francs in the same period. Was it coincidence that these shares did so extraordinarily well in the same year that American politicians were lobbied? Gross though this normal practice of business corrupting our elected officials obviously is, arguably the most grotesque manipulation of so-called democratic governments is the iniquitous collusion between the arms industry and politicians. For example, here's Simon Hogarth once again. In 1988, the House of Representatives had to consider a modest amendment, one which would have obliged gun buyers to wait 7 days before collecting their purchases, whilst the police checked them out. The amendment was tossed aside. Of the 228 members who voted against it, no fewer than 193 had received money from the National Rifle Association, which is a very rich and powerful organisation to protect the interests of the multi-billion-dollar small arms industry. Of course, war has always been conducted in the name of profit. Over 100 years ago, the British arms manufacturer Vickers employed an arms dealer called Sir Basil Zakharov. starting him on £88,000 and quickly turned him into a millionaire. And remember, this was over 100 years ago, when ordinary people could buy a reasonable house for a couple of £100. Zakharov said, "I made wars so I could sell arms to both sides." There's nothing new about politicians being manipulated by the very wealthy, or working hand in fist with each other like partners in a new business venture. Traditionally in Britain, it has been the landed gentry in the driving seat, routinely supplying members of their families for both houses of Parliament, routinely ensuring that parliamentary business was settled according to the interests of those same powerful elites. The so-called Industrial Revolution created the first generation of a new aristocracy, a new breed of people whose wealth was not derived from exploiting those who worked the land. The new breed of aristocrats were bankers, businessmen, traders, and entrepreneurs. Whilst the old aristocracy pared down their noses at the arrival of new money, the hard fact was that the old king was dead, and the new, keener, more ruthless monarch had kicked and gouged its way to the throne, demanding the same humble submission from the same luckless millions who are always exploited, no matter what type of aristocrat is clutching the reins of power. The commercial sector operates a very similar model to our traditional monarchy, but has become infinitely more powerful. Almost every large organisation has its own unelected king and court, comprising people driven entirely by self-interest. Given the fact that their country has been similarly managed for centuries, why should they think or behave any differently? It's a point that has been observed many times before. Consider, for example, the historians J.L. and Barbara Hammond writing on the industrial situation in England at the dawn of the 19th century. It seemed to this oligarchy the most natural thing in the world that the economic structure should resemble the political structure, and that in the mill, as in the state, all this power should be concentrated in the hands of a few men who were to act and think for the rest. Economic science seemed to add a sanction to the law of inequality. In industrial as in political life, the mass of men must be content with an obedience that asks no questions. Because British citizens have absolutely no influence over the decisions of their political leaders, the precedent exists for the business world to extend the practice to the workplace. Most workers are never involved in the decisions that affect their working lives, and the support for these decisions is therefore seldom better than lukewarm. The car industry in Britain is a typical example. Run at first on the traditional British model of management, with unelected monarchs and ambitious self-interested courts imposing their will upon the workforce, the entire industry imploded within 2 generations, with the trade unions being blamed for its demise. But when Japanese management, heavily reliant upon worker involvement in decision-making, and passionate exponents of leadership by example, reinvented the British motor industry using the self-same workforce, it blossomed and flourished. The British civil service, traditionally rooted in an old aristocracy, had, until quite recent times, maintained something of a buffer between the more extreme demands of the business lobby and the decisions made by governments. However, blinded by the glitzy salesmanship of the American model and gulled by their own aristocratic greed and stupidity, the Thatcher government pioneered the replacement of the civil service with the corporate boardroom. Privatisation was born. In 1997, tired of Tory tricks and encouraged by traditional Labour rhetoric, British voters tried to throw out the capitalists in favour of those who were supposed to represent more normal people. Or so it thought. But it was already too late. Far from being the white knights of the working classes and reversing this calamitous decision once it had the chance, Blair's New Labour instantly betrayed its electors and warmly embraced privatisation, exactly like the born-again Tories they soon revealed themselves to be. Traditionally suspicious of the civil service with their aristocratic roots, this new Labour government rapidly surrounded itself with advisers from the aristocracy of big business. Private consultancies such as Anderson's, KPMG, Ernst & Young, etc. Rightly recognising that if it could please the world of big business by letting it take over the functions of government, life would be considerably smoother for these so-called new Labour politicians than if they were to do anything as ridiculous as fulfilling the expectations of those who voted for them. 10 years of New Labour effectively finished off what their Tory predecessors had started. The so-called private finance initiative quickly infected every tiny corner of government, central and local, in every tiny corner of the country, siphoning off billions of pounds of taxpayers' money into the personal offshore bank accounts of countless consultants and company directors, and legally committing taxpayers to ruinous service contracts for decades to come. The sinister relationship between our public services and big business has extended to the two sectors working in cahoots with each other to rob the citizen, much as any pair of common criminals might. The journalist Ben Webster gave the following example in an article in the Times. The DVLA, which is the government department responsible for vehicle and driver licensing, is selling drivers' names and addresses to wheel camping companies that break industry rules by charging drivers more than £500 for minor parking breaches. The DVLA made more than £4 million last year by selling the details of 1.6 million drivers. Then there's a buoyant trade in cash for honours. This is a peculiarly British custom with obvious direct connections to its traditional aristocratic roots, and it's as deeply embedded in British history as the monarchy itself. Honours and peerages are routinely doled out every year to those who have supposedly served their country in some particular and exceptional way. Although some of these awards do indeed go to particularly deserving people, many do not. As the writer Anthony Sampson has pointed out, it is not surprising that most ambitious people still long to be ennobled, or that the rich are prepared to pay large sums to political parties to become lords and ladies. The process of buying a peerage remains discreet, and observers argue about the going price. Broadcaster Jon Snow told MPs that in 2003 the word on the street suggested about £250,000. BBC journalist Robert Preston reveals many of the sordid details in his book Who Runs Britain, concluding the chapter titled Democracy for Sale with these words. The leader of a party created to give voice to the neediest and most oppressed was attempting to confer political power on the wealthy for no other conspicuous reason than that they had the financial means to keep him in power. The Tories, too, showed a careless disregard for the principles of democracy by routinely giving peerages to donors. The fact that true heroes and really saintly people are rewarded in exactly the same manner as ruthless businessmen whose only service to the country is the payment of substantial sums of cash to political parties is simply a cynical subterfuge to give respectability to a practice which, when seen happening in other countries, we call corruption. Genuine achievers like top sports personalities, artists and humanitarians are the people who give real value to honorary titles, value upon which the phony achievers, retiring civil servants, soldiers and corrupt businessmen, have long exploited.